you can go ahead.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this next iteration of the Georgetown University Wargame Society virtual talks. This talk's on the Influence Wargaming Handbook. My name is Colin Marston, and I work at the UK Ministry of Defence's Defence Science and Technology Laboratory within the Defence Wargaming Centre we have there. If you're interested in finding out more about this organisation, please take a look at an earlier dstl Georgetown talk on the analytical approaches to national security gaming, which some of my colleagues delivered back in May 2021. You can also find out details about dstl on the UK government website. The aim of this presentation is really just to give you a preview of the Influence Wargaming Handbook, which will be published next month. So before I could begin, I'd also like to get my co-presenter, Graham Longley-Brown, to say also a few words as well. Graham, to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to be with you. I am an ex-regular British Army officer. I'm still in the British Army Reserves. I left the Army in 2003. Since then, so for 20 years now, I have been a professional wargame designer and facilitator. Along the way, I've also written stuff, the MOD Wargaming Handbook, excuse me, along with Colin. And then I wrote my own book, Successful Professional Wargames. I've also written the British Army's Course of Action Wargaming Doctrine. And just recently, again, with Colin, we've written this thing called the Influence Wargaming Handbook, and that brings you up to date. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. You can also find a short summary of our bios on the Georgetown Wargaming website. You can find out more about some of the things that both Graham and I have done in the past. Go on to the next slide, please, Graham. So when Seb first asked if we'd give this briefing, Graham, I did not know where we'd be in the publication process of the handbook. However, I'm pleased to say that we have actually come a long way from when Seb first asked us. And actually, this first slide you see here with this the image of the Influence Wargaming Handbook is the official front cover of that document, and that is actually going to be released in 3 weeks' time. I'll talk about that right at the end of the presentation about where you can actually find the Influence Wargaming Handbook. The handbook has been produced as a partnership between UK MOD's Defence Science Technology Research Programme and also the Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre, which is responsible for doing our Concepts and Doctrine publication. They're also responsible for the Influence Wargaming, the MOD Wargaming Handbook as well. The core writing team that's been led by Graham and myself, and really we could not have produced this handbook alone. So we've actually drawn on the experience of a number of wargaming and influence experts from within the UK, but also with about 30 international allies and partners, including Australia, United States, Canada, Netherlands, and colleagues within NATO. Some of you might actually be on this call. I know some of you are. So really to all those people that have been involved in writing this project, we want to say a big thank you to you all over the last 2 years producing this particular product. Next slide, please, Graham.
I'm trying.
That's okay. Okay, so before we get started and get into the details, I want to talk about a couple of other publications that relate to the document itself. So first of all, the Influence Wargaming Handbook is a sister publication to the MOD Wargaming Handbook, which you see on this slide here today. That Wargaming Handbook is what Graham and I wrote back in 2017. And the purpose of the Wargaming Handbook is to provide a context and guidance for wargaming. And it's really designed principally just to introduce the topic. It was not a detailed manual or practitioner's technical guide. And since its publication back in 2017, it's often featured on reading lists for wargaming courses to help provide that introduction to the professional application of wargaming. So to avoid repetition, the Influence Wargaming Handbook does reference specific sections of the Wargaming Handbook. So for example, on this slide here, we've got the wargaming process, which is an entire chapter in the MOD Wargaming Handbook. So we don't repeat any of this kind of material in the Influence Wargaming Handbook, but just refer to it so people can actually use the two documents together when designing and delivering, in this case, an Influence wargame. As with all publications I mentioned in this introduction, you can download all of them for free from the UK government website. The best way to find those links, the links are in the presentation, but actually just run an internet search, say the MOD Wargaming Handbook, you'll find that in the top of the search engine. So that's the best way to go and find all these documents. Next slide, please, Graham. So the next publication we make reference to is the Red Teaming Handbook. The Red Teaming Handbook is a sister publication to the MAD Wargaming Handbook. Red teaming is the independent application of a range of structured, creative, and critical thinking techniques to assist the end user into making better informed decision or produce a more robust product. It should not be confused with red cell, which is a common we referred to. So it's not that aspect, it's very much the aspect that I've just spoken about already. And again, you can find this document, if you just search for Red Teaming Handbook, you'll find this document in its third edition now on our government website. Okay, and then the next slide, please, which will talk about one of the final publications that we reference, which is the Allied Joint Doctrine for Information Operations, which only came out literally a couple of months ago. So it's a really, really useful document to get a comprehensive understanding of the information environment. It's also how information operations, so InfoOps, in terms of the staff, ensure the coordination and synchronization of information activities. It is a standard NATO document, and noting how individual nations can sometimes use different terminologies for the same or similar things, we have, where possible, with the Influence Wargaming Handbook, used and aligned ourselves with NATO terms. So hopefully that's something we'll talk about later on, and Graham's got a particular point to make on the terms and definitions that we actually use for the handbook to help situate the audience. Okay, next slide, please. So you can see those three core documents which relate to our Influence Wargaming Handbook. So basically, the Influence Wargaming Handbook does assume a level of knowledge on wargaming, red teaming, and information operations. And if you want to find out more about that information, you can go to any one of these particular documents to find that information out. Okay, next slide. So that's kind of the background of the documents that are going to relate to the Influence Wargaming Handbook. The next question really to kind of quickly answer is, why have an Influence Wargaming Handbook? I think that's a very important question for us to kind of answer. Firstly, human behaviour is a central concern of much of defence and security activity, and operational success frequently depends on influencing the attitudes, perceptions, and behaviours of different audiences. We've also got alongside that the character warfare, which is changing quite rapidly, which is driven really by that persuasiveness of the information and the pace of technological change. There's also a demand to consider problems within a problem space that spans what we call the continuum of competition. I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but that's how we look at things like cooperation, rivalry, and confrontation, which are kind of like below the threshold of armed conflict. And then, of course, you've got actually armed conflict itself. So that's a really, really important thing that we've seen that is changing. During interviews with all the various influence practitioners, we often heard that influence should be baked into the plan and not sprinkled on at the end. So there's a real kind of a question there about how can we actually again better represent influence within our decision making right at the very, very, very start. And actually the question there becomes then is, what role could then wargaming have to support that as an aspect? We also understand that the representation of influence effects is also of variable kind of quality. It's also difficult to represent influence within wargames today. So noting all of the above, and when speaking with the wargaming community, there are a number of individuals out there that recognise both the challenges that I just kind of mentioned on this slide, but also the direction of travel regarding the near-term and future problem sets that we see. So there's actually a really, opportunity in there for wargaming as a technique that can bring, bring and help us look at these problems as it has with other areas in the various kind of domains. So the demand for the handbook to support, the community was born. Next slide. And that was really kind of emphasised really when we ran our initial Influence Wargaming conference back in July 21, which is really kind of exploring the utility and interest in using wargaming as a technique to explore influence and information activities. So it was at that conference we set ourselves the challenging of generating a handbook within the next 2 years. And I'm pleased to say we've met that target. So in 3 months, you're all going to get yourselves hands on this particular kind of publication. As I've already said before, I want to say a real big thank you to all those that helped us produce this particular handbook along the way. So thank you. And over to you now, Graham, for your next set of slides.
Thank you very much indeed. And I just noticed that Brian Train has joined us. Brian, he was talking to you just then. Thank you for all the help along the way. Okay, so to the handbook then. It might be worth, while I'm just introducing this slide, just taking a screenshot. And the reason for that is that, as Colin's already alluded to, influence is not actually very well understood. and the representation of influence is of variable quality, quote unquote. So what we found is really important is whatever we're doing when it comes to influence, at least as a minimum, get across the lexicon, the basic minimum, make sure that people understand the terms that we're referring to. So yeah, take a screenshot if you can, don't worry if you can't. Another convention we're going to use during this presentation is we're going to highlight key points in red. So you'll see that as we go through. Doesn't mean the rest can be ignored, but just now, therefore, just register while I've got this screen showing the definition of audience, that is absolutely central for obvious reasons, the definition of information environment, and also, Colin's just alluded to this, red team, the challenge function, as opposed to red cell. So I hope you've had long enough to digest that slide. Last chance to take a screenshot, and I'm moving on in a couple of seconds. Okay, we have got, I'm delighted to say, in terms of the UK, the highest level support. So this is a quote from our Secretary of State for Defence, and that really matters. And getting senior support for all books on wargaming, be they doctrine, informal, and everything that we do in wargaming is really, really important. Just now, we have that senior support, which is fantastic. I'm mindful of Peter Perler's sine wave of enthusiasm for wargaming. If the senior support drops away, so there is a risk that the support for wargaming will drop away. But we have got support from the highest level, which is fantastic. Okay, to the handbook itself then. Now, again, the convention we're going to use throughout this presentation is, and I don't know if you can see my pointer, doesn't really matter. We're going to start with all these kind of spider diagrams. We're going to start top left. So I'll talk through the preface, and then we'll work our way through the chapters. But when you see these slides with bubbles, we will start top left and work our way around in a clockwise fashion. We'll split this up so that I'll do a boring doctrine bit at the start, and then Colin will do chapter 1, and we'll alternate between the chapters. So that's how we'll approach it. Obviously, the takeaway from this slide is the purpose, which you can see top left. And the first point I'll make is this is novel and innovative work, and when we set out, we had no idea where this was going. It is absolutely still a work in progress, so please do not think of this handbook as a definitive guide to how to do influence wargaming. It is not. It's a kind of snapshot of where we are now, but then most importantly, a prompt for others and ourselves to continue the research. So you can see the outline of the handbook. Just note now it's split into 2 parts. I'll talk to those in the next slide. And then finally, note the scope in the bottom right. As Colin's already alluded to, this is not a guide as to how to do influence, nor is it a detailed guide to how to do wargaming. The wargaming is contained in the MOD Wargaming Handbook. So this is very much how to bring influence to the wargaming table, literally. Okay, so to the preface, as I said, I'll start top left and work my way around. I'm just going to give you a little burst of doctrine, and this, you know, this really does matter. So these are the 3 doctrinal tenets of UK defence doctrine, and they are so important. So the manoeuvrist approach and mission command is how we conduct operations. This might, when you read it, come across as a little bit fighty, a little bit war fighty. It's not. These things, sorry, it is, but they can also be applied to things other than war fighting, but they primarily talk to war fighting. And you'll notice in the manoeuvrist approach, putting strength against weakness, shattering the enemy's overall cohesion and will to fight. Mission command, I recommend it to everybody. It's just the best way of going about your business. But the hook for us is quite recently integrated action has been added to the tenets of military defence, UK defence doctrine. And that is where the audience-centric, I asked you to note the definition of audience just now, and blinding glimpse of the obvious, everything we do is to influence the attitude and behaviour of selected audiences in order to achieve success. So integrated action is absolutely where influence and the Influence Wargaming Handbook now bolts on to our fundamental doctrine. So that's the doctrine bit, boring bit over. I'll now hand back to Colin for chapter 1.
Thank you, Graham. So I'm going to point out a few bits before getting to this kind of particular chapter. So here we're in part 1 for the sponsor. And there's a couple of style things we've done in the handbook as well to make it obvious to those that have got the handbook to know whether they're in the sponsor section or in the practitioner section. So if you're in the sponsor section, you'll see here, this is from the chapter 1 opening page. We've got the quote there on the left-hand side and a image on the right-hand side to help set the scene for the particular kind of chapter. Then we have these accents on the right-hand side. We've got the kind of blue, light blue chapter 1, and then there'll be a slightly different shade of blue for those chapters that are in part 2. So this is very much a handbook, a guide, as Graham just kind of alluded to help to people as they go along. So we very much see it as a document that you have in front of you, and you utilize it in the same way that people we've seen utilize the MOD Wargaming Handbook itself. So getting into part 1 for the sponsor then, and I don't know if you can read the quote there on this particular kind of slide, but essentially we thought that this image and this quote was a really powerful way to kind of get at the point about why wargame influence. So we've said a lot of words like doctrinal language in the early introduction of earlier previous slides, but I really think this one slide kind of captures the importance of why wargame influence. And so this chapter really gets at describing influence and wargaming and explains why influence is important and why wargaming is particularly suited to exploring and representing influence itself. Next slide, please, Graham. Okay, and as Graham's already said, in terms of giving a preview of each chapter, we use these kind of bubble diagrams, as you've seen for the first one, and these will build up as we go forward. And so really, this slide here really just gives you the aspects, the preview of the various kind of chapter titles, and then we're going to build that up with a lot of kind of bullet points that each of those kind of bubbles represent, and then we'll pick out a few of those in red and unpack those just for particular kind of interest. Fortunately, we don't have time to go through the entirety of the handbook and all the kind of areas, so really I'm just giving you very much a preview of the particular document. So the first area to unpack is describe what is influence and what is the information environment. So next slide, Graham. So you see in the top right in just a moment, you'll see a definition, and we talked about terms just a moment ago. So as Graham said, we're used to the screenshot there, but I've just picked out the definition there of influence, and therefore also highlighting a particular diagram, which is going to put up onto the next slide, please, Graham. So this slide here, I think, is one of the really useful diagrams here to kind of understand, firstly, why influence wargaming is important, and also why influence wargaming requires a different kind of mindset and approach than previous. So this slide graphic is the information environment, and this is really well described in the information operations document I provided earlier. We'll just cover it a little bit in Influence Wargaming Handbook. But really to kind of explain it for now and for all of you to kind of understand when we talk about influence wargaming, what that means, noting the kind of rough terminology here. Here in this diagram, you've got basically 3 dimensions. You've got a cognitive dimension, a virtual dimension, and a physical dimension. There are several layers within each of those dimensions. So for example, right at the bottom, you've got physical network infrastructure, physical objects, and geographic locations. All of that is part of the physical dimension. So influence is achieved by creating effects across all of those dimensions within the information environment. The information environment is defined as the environment comprised of the information itself, the individuals, the organizations, and the systems that receive and process and convey that information, and the cognitive virtual and physical spaces in which this actually occurs. So influence effects span and blur the strategic, operational, and tactical levels of operation that sometimes we kind of constrain ourselves to when we're designing our war games or thinking about this kind of problem. So when you look at it here, you've got to really think about this diagram and the areas you're trying to represent. And also, how does that result from the information activities that need to be synchronized across all of our domains? The domains in UK doctrine languages, the maritime, the land, the air, space, cyber, and electromagnetic operational domains. And how do we then coordinate between the organizations that are all capable of delivering influence effects within this kind of space? So this diagram, I think, is a really useful diagram to think about if you're designing a war game or the design stage, about how are you representing across that cognitive, virtual, and physical dimension for the particular problem set that you're doing. And are you just too much focused, say, for example, in the geographic or of the physical dimension and not thinking about how information and activities and actions might relate across all the other three that we have here. So I think that's a really, really powerful diagram to utilize. Next slide, Graham. You can see now on this slide, we've now expanded those bullet points. And I'll let you just scan over this slide for just a moment to see what we're covering each of those kind of various kind of parts of the bubble diagrams. I'm going to pick out a couple of the red bits. This would be the kind of theme that Graham and I use out throughout describing some of these kind of chapters. So first of all, looking at the top right there and the statement that's made there between conventional and influence wargaming. I mean, essentially, influence wargaming does not supplant conventional wargaming, which we kind of typified by force on force and kinetic activity. Rather, it's a complementary activity. However, though, it should be noted that wargaming influence requires that different mindset. And I think that previous diagram I was just talking about really kind of shows the kind of mindset you need to get into when you're considering to look at the influence wargaming kind of situation. We now go to the bottom left of this diagram, and we'll talk about a number of things that kind of make why is wargaming kind of different. So, for example, influence wargames are potentially unbounded in scope. Even the most cursory kind of zooming out, what appears to be a bounded situation reveals that all aspects and instruments of the national power, so those things that relate to like DIME, so the diplomatic, the information, the military, and the economic, or the systems on which those instruments act, so things like the MISI framework's really useful here, so the political, the military, the economic, the social, the information, and the infrastructure are likely to be all affected by any military activity because of that interconnected and complex global environment. So the question for influence wargamers is where and how to bound the problem under consideration to make examining it practical. In addition, you've got also influence wargames deal in unknown unknowns. So I'm just going to unpack that slowly. So information in conventional wargame generally takes the form of either a known known or a known unknown. So, for example, the location of forces are either confirmed, estimated, or unknown. But in that latter case, understanding the broad composition of enemy forces triggers activity to find missing elements. Influence wargames, though, regularly reveal unknown unknowns, so eliciting factors and audiences that we did not know about or did not consider even important. So, furthermore, they often reveal what we think we know actually is not so, and that our beliefs and understanding are wrong in that particular kind of case. So, in summary, despite the challenges of influence wargaming, the conclusion must be made that more effort needs to be done to develop and practice it. It is an emerging technique, and we can use the powerful technique of wargaming to help us understand and influence and understand information activities. So I think that's the really, really kind of message we're trying to put across in this initial first chapter. Graham.
Thank you. Just had a big message, so you're still muted. So chapter 2, we are still in part 1, so we are still absolutely talking to the sponsors or the commissioners of wargames. And we're now picking up on points that we've alluded to already. Influence is not well understood. Influence wargaming is not well understood. And to be honest, wargaming is not particularly well understood. The so what of that is that we need the new mindset. We need senior people to understand the new mindset and to adopt a proactive style of leadership. And that quote from Little Heart we thought was particularly apposite, and that talks, I think, to what Colin said earlier about influence needs to be baked into the plan, not sprinkled on top. It is still too much of an adjunct. So chapter 2 then covers these things, and you'll see in the italics above the title, we are talking to the sponsor, the sorts of things that sponsors might do need to think about. And we also explicitly mention risks, because there is a school that influence wargaming is very difficult. Yes, it is. That's the point of the handbook. And it is very risky. It can lead to strategic miscalculation. That is not a reason that we should not do it. As Colin's just alluded to, the takeaway from chapter 1 is we have to do it more to do it better. So that needs leadership. And these are the kind of things that we absolutely need. This is not a nice to have, it is essential. We need the commissioners, the sponsors to do those things. Now, that you can see in the bullet list. Now, in the handbook, the bit in red, there is a bulleted list of 16 challenges that we need to get across to the sponsor, because at the end of this chapter, the sponsor can stop reading. Those challenges we're not going to show you now, because Colin will cover them as we do in the handbook when we get to chapter 3. So those are coming up. The primary considerations for the sponsor, you can see here. I'll just give you a second to scan those bullets, and then I'll just pick out the ones in red. And the first point is there's a lot. And this is not to say that there's not a lot in conventional wargaming, but in influence wargaming, these things are absolutely crucial. So we've just spoken to it about bounding scope. It is so easy to start with a really tactical engagement, and as soon as you start zooming out, within a few minutes of zooming out, you're up to geopolitical considerations. What does the UN think about it, whatever it may be. So if you look at the fourth bullet down, the factors to be represented, it is absolutely crucial for the wargame design that the aim and the objectives are achievable and they are bounded, and you are focused, laser focused on the things that you need to be examining in the wargame. Understanding audiences' perspectives, we've talked to that, the centrality of audiences. I don't think it needs explaining any further, but it is really, really important. Wargame control. So I'm going to put this diagram up in the next slide and I'm going to blow it up. This is not to say that a lot of what I'm just about to say does not apply to conventional war games or normal war games, if you like. It absolutely does. I'm just going to highlight a few things that are particularly pertinent to influence war games. So this is, as I said, a relatively standard control diagram. Things are scalable. You might find that just one person fulfills all of these roles. You could think of these roles as functions. So, for example, there could be an adjudication function, which is discharged by a large team of people. So this can scale from one person up to many, even distributed teams fulfilling these functions. But the key points I want to bring out is that and this is standard stuff, the facilitator is the focus and is the front of house and works to the game controller. And the game controller is responsible for making sure that the influence war game hits those bounded, the aim and the bounded objectives. So working all the time to the game controller. The rest of this, again, relatively conventional stuff, but I just want to highlight the criticality of the red team. And that is, as Colin said, that is red team, the challenge function. It is not red cell adversary. This is the challenge. And you can see there, we've ascribed it to the lead red teamer or the red team. Absolutely critical that they identify and mitigate cognitive biases and they challenge assumptions, because we are dealing with such a soft area and such a potentially unbounded area. They have to fulfill that function. And then the other person I'm going to bring out is the lead adjudicator, because adjudication, i.e. the determination of the outcomes of players' decisions or actions, again, absolutely central to all conventional war games, critical to influence war games, because the outcomes, as you're going to see in chapter 3, can be very, very varied. So that is, I think, enough about control. Just look at now over to the left-hand side. I'm not going to go through that whole list. You'll be delighted to know. Just take a few seconds to scan it. There is, again, a lot there. So we're talking to the sponsor. So when you've got, hey, sponsor, think about the primary considerations. That's pretty mind-blowing. Hey, sponsor, here's a checklist that will help you. But there are some really crunchy issues here that the sponsor needs to deal with. I hope you've had time to read it. You can obviously come back and have a look at it. But the only one I'm going to pull out is the one in red, which I hope all of us do. And this is now responsible evangelism, Rex Brynon's concept. Wargaming is not necessarily the only or the best way to study some of these issues. So that is why we have put that as question 1 for the sponsor's checklist. So that's the end of chapter 2. At this point, as you can see on the bottom of the screen, sponsors can now stop and go and do something more important, because the second part, chapters 2, 3, and the annexes, is now for the wargame practitioner, on which note back to Colin.
Thank you, Graham. It's also worth noting out that part 1 is actually, when you look at the handbook and we look at the design and how we've done it, that's a very short part of the overall handbook. The majority of the information is there in the practitioner section where it belongs for doing the design and delivery of these war games. You'll notice now the difference between chapters 1 and 2 now to chapters 3 in the style change here. So now we go for full image on the left-hand side, which collates together, in this case, a number of images to show different representations of influence. And then we have the quotes up in the top right-hand side. So again, it's a really good just visual guide there to kind of show that you're in the practitioner section and not the sponsors section. So the thing about this particular kind of chapter is actually the quotes that we utilize for this document. So we actually use 2 quotes here. We've got the one from Peter Perler, which is it's important to make one thing clear at the very start. Designing and delivering a war game is an art and not a science. And that is then next to a really, really good quote also from Pablo Picasso here, where art is the elimination of the unnecessary. We felt that those 2 quotes were really, really important for this section for the practitioner and in designing influence war games and going through that kind of design stage process, trying to work out what information you're trying to abstract for the particular problem that you're looking at. Next slide, Graham. So this chapter then, chapter 3, and challenges to wargaming influence. So each challenge that we've identified is basically done by illustrating the differences between conventional and influence war games. Now, one of the challenges we had was how we would illustrate or find photos of influence, which is a really difficult thing to do for the Wargaming Handbook. But you take something like influence and influence wargaming, you knew this is going to be a really, really tough kind of ask. And we really thought it was really, really important to convey both the, a visual way of trying to represent the problem as well as the text way, so people could really kind of assess the information we're putting together here. Now, we have to thank a particular individual to helping us do all the graphics, including the graphics you see here on this screen. And these are all the work of Tom Fisher, who's a Canadian graphic designer who worked with us on the graphics. He also designed and worked on a number of games for professional purposes, so really understood our requirement and challenge in this particular kind of case. And Graham and I have done work with Tom Fisher on other work as well, in particular, and Rex Bryan's on the call. He was obviously pivotal work with Rex on doing the Matrix game construction kit a few years back now. So Tom Fisher and his graphics, I think, were really, really good and helped us to understand the problem. Next slide, Graham. So we're just going to go through now very, very slowly and put up all the challenges. And I'll just kind of read through the challenges. There's 16 challenges in total, and we've themed them into 3 different kind of areas. So I'm just going to give yourself a chance to digest the first challenges we've got here that are under the scenario, narrative, and objectives. And then we'll slowly build up all 16 challenges, and then we'll then talk about a few of those individually in just a moment. Okay, next slide, Graham. Okay, and then the next final set. Okay, so in total there, we've identified 16 challenges of interest. And so I mentioned at the start of the presentation, Graham and I had to draw on the experience of a number of wargaming and influencer experts to produce the handbook. And for this chapter, I really want to thank a particular individual, Peter Williams, for his inputs in putting this chapter together. Peter Williams is a research specialist in wargaming for Defence and Science and Technology Group in Australia. Incidentally, he's also featured in Georgetown discussing the Defence Analytical Wargaming Network forecast back in 2021. And when we put first drafts together of the handbook, I'm trying to work out, is this book useful to the community of interest? We came up with actually going where we really need this chapter 3 to try and really kind of understand, what are the challenges to wargaming influence, so then we as a community can address these challenges and move forward in utilising wargaming in this particular area. So just want to kind of say a big thank you to Peter Williams and his input into this work. Graham, if you now go to the next slide, we're then going to highlight the 5 or 6 challenges we're just going to just talk very, very briefly about to give you an idea of what we talk about in this particular kind of aspect. So we go to the first challenge, I think is, so challenge 2 here then. So again, graphics by Tom Fisher here, which I think really kind of usefully illustrate this particular point. So influence wargame teams are likely to be diverse and different. So what do we mean by that? So in a conventional war games, teams are generally going to be the same and typically all military. So what does that mean? So the players in those roles will be very familiar with operating with each other and within whatever context the war game is representing. However, when we look at then influence war games, then each side, and there'll be obviously multiple sides here, will likely consist of multidisciplinary players who may not have worked with each other at all. Teams will be multifunctional and not necessarily have the same composition. And I see in the chat some questions there about, is this a defense product, or that's kind of described, why we're having this actual development of the book in the first place. But this is a product for all of defence and government. So for us in the UK, this publication, being a UK publication, is defence and government. So we have to look at it from that kind of aspect. I think when I talk about this particular kind of challenge, you understand why. So if you think about influence war games, are likely to have more of a diverse and different set of teams than it would be in a typical kind of conventional kind of wargaming team role. So that's just one challenge there, just unpacked. Next slide, Greg. So we talked earlier, in the very start, chapter 1, about the continuum of a spectrum of competition. And so really challenge 3 says that influence war games focus on rivalry and confrontation, not just armed conflict. So a term that's been used an awful lot, which we don't no longer use in the UK, is this like sub-threshold kind of language. And really what we're talking about really here is the continuum of competition. So the diagram on the left-hand side there, you can see goes from cooperation, rivalry to confrontation, and it crosses over the threshold of armed conflict, which is obviously a very defined state of armed conflict. So in conventional games, the context for conventional war games is overwhelmingly orientated towards warfighting, and historically the primary use of the wargaming technique. However, in influence, most influence war games will be set during those protracted periods of constant rivalry, interspersed with confrontation, and sometimes armed conflict. So you've got to be able to examine both sides of the threshold of war simultaneously. So thinking through that kind of like trying to maintain a competition state, which is obviously going to involve a level of crisis and trying to avoid getting yourselves into conflict, going back to that competition state. So that's a really one of the challenges here with kind of considering the kind of problem sets we have for influence war games. Next slide, please, Graham. Okay, so next challenge, which is picking out here, is influence war games require a greater understanding of the audience perspectives. So understanding the audiences, and we mentioned this in the start, is really, really important to influence wargaming. But obviously understanding audience perspectives is notoriously difficult. This tends not to be an issue in conventional wargaming, where effects relate primarily to the physical dimension, for example, say destroying an enemy itself or capturing a geographic location. So in influence wargames, understanding the audience perspectives is of paramount importance. So acquiring, though, reliable data on the audiences and those perspectives, though, becomes difficult. And even where there is a baseline that exists on that information, attitudes and behaviours can change rapidly, making it difficult to assess that impact and the actions taken in the wargame itself. So this is what this kind of graphic here is illustrating, and we go into a discussion on that in the actual handbook itself. Next challenge, Graham. So here we're looking at how influence war games must contain both behavioural and physical science approaches. I talked earlier on about the information environment and that need about the physical, the cognitive and the virtual, then trying to draw on how methods, tools and techniques are going to help design your adjudication for that war game. You're going to need both behavioural science techniques as well as physical science approaches in there to help you kind of do this. So, in conventional, quantifying outcomes in conventional war games is possible, although sometimes challenging. But operational research and historical analysis, spanning some like 200 years of modern wargaming, and they have relatively high levels of confidence to be assigned to say something like combat outcomes. In influence, though, the diffuse and currently poorly understood effects represented in influence war games rely heavily on qualitative and social science approaches. There's a challenge there we need to kind of develop in that kind of approach and try and utilize both behavioural and physical science approaches when designing and delivering our influence war games. Next challenge, Graham. This is one of my Lux graphic here. So challenge 13, influence effects can propagate unpredictably. So conventional there on the right-hand side of the diagram there, actions generally result in first order effects and maybe second order effects. However, in influence and their effects, they can commonly cause cascading third, fourth, and fifth order effects, and are likely to propagate across a wide number of nodes across all dimensions of the information environment. So that's kind of like, we've got a really good picture to kind of show that challenge. I think this is a really kind of good way of showing that and trying to understand how we kind of get at that particular problem itself. Next challenge. So challenge 15 then, information in influence war games is open to many different interpretations. And this has to be one of my favorite images in the handbook. So it's the parable of the blind man and an elephant. It's a story of a group of blind men who never come across an elephant before, who learn and imagine what an elephant is like by touching it. That's what this picture kind of shows. And that's really good, I think, at kind of explaining this particular kind of challenge. So being conventional, we've got information in conventional war games generally has an objective ground truth value. This is either known to the player or unknown, and often presented as a common operating picture. In influence war game, the same data can be represented or interpreted differently depending on the context and the player biases itself. So a really interesting challenge there for us to grapple with, but a really good image kind of explains particular kind of a problem that we have to address. So I think that kind of covers the summary of the challenges we want to kind of pick out. So there's 16 challenges in there with details on all of them, and comparisons between influence and conventional, and what the so what is of both of those kind of challenges. We can now move on to chapter 4. Graham.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so having set out the challenges, and it is difficult, let's not kid ourselves. This is, use the word challenging, this is not an easy thing to do. What we have tried to do in chapter 4, so this is now firmly directed at the practitioner, across the whole wargaming team, is just to address the challenges. But expectation management, as we said right up front, the handbook is a prompt. It is our thoughts so far, gleaned from across the wargaming community as far as we've been able to. It is not a definitive answer and does not it does not purport to be. It is, if anything, a prompt for more work to be done. We still have to address the fundamental mindset. That's where the quote comes in. And if Jim Woolman, who a lot of you I hope will know, was on the call, the answer to any question about this will be, it depends, because there is absolutely no one set answer. There is no one size fits all solution. So chapter 4 then is some suggestions just to prompt that discussion. And that's what that chapter intro, we cannot absolutely address it. If we tried to address every single challenge and define every way of doing influence wargaming, firstly, we couldn't. And secondly, the handbook would become several encyclopedias long. So we have been able to do only what we can do. And I'm going to build these slides as we have done normally with these bubbles. There's going to be an element of wave topping here. Obviously, when you get your hands on the Influence Wargaming Handbook itself, you can see the detail, but this will just be to introduce some of the key ideas. So again, in terms of sections, this is representing the information environment. The top left bubble, methods of representing the information environment. I'll show you a slide in a few slides time, not immediately, and just go through some ways of doing that. I'm not going to talk to the other bubbles. I will pause momentarily on deception. Deception is obviously central to influence and influence wargaming. So there's a whole section on that. A shout out to Stephen Downes-Martin, who's done a lot of work in this area. The only point I'll make at this stage about scenarios is that the depth required to give players the levers that they need to, or the vectors to have influence effect, we are finding, or the received wisdom is that predicates towards a very deep scenario, which could well mean that you have to use real world. Obviously, with the security, the sensitivity issues, we understand that, but real world is where you get into the complexity that you probably need. I'll just throw out the terminology, probably very familiar to you guys, not so much the military. We found micro, meso, and macro more useful than tactical, operational, and strategic. Okay, wargaming approaches. The whole book is predicated on an understanding of wargaming. So we do not explain what those approaches are. We just introduce them and give some pros and cons and illustrate where they could be particularly useful to influence wargaming. Games and game turns and turn lengths. Again, the only points I'm going to bring out are, and this might be blindingly obvious, some of these points are blindingly obvious, but they need to be made. To get into those cascading effects, as Colin's just alluded to, the second, third, fourth, etc. Effects, multiple turns, because, and that might sound really obvious, but as we're going through war games just now, they tend to have only 1 or 2 turns, and you don't really see those cascading effects. So we found 5-ish, TBC is pretty much where we need to be, or more than 5. And then the other bit I'll put out here is the epilogue phase. So, you know, influence is all about stories. It's all about the narrative, and the influence war game is exactly that. So we found it really useful to have a storyteller, someone who pulls the narrative together, and at the end of the war game, we found that person to be particularly useful just to draw the story together, and that does more than just reinforce the narrative. It tees up the after action review. I'm going to come to that in a couple of builds time. Campaign games and integration with wider activities, absolutely crucial. A single game is absolutely not going to answer the questions that need to be answered. It's probably going to raise more questions. So influence war games need to be integrated with other activities. You need to be able to branch to sequel, to go back, so on and so forth. Okay, so adjudication. As I said earlier, crucial. I'm going to show you a slide just with a couple of very simple examples, same as I'm going to do with the information environment, but I just want to talk now to red teaming, which is an absolute primary mitigation to a lot of the risks when it comes to influence wargaming. I'm not going to go through that list. You can see it yourselves. Cognitive biases are endemic in influence wargames for the obvious reasons. A lot of it is subjective. So red teaming, the challenge function, is critical. Wargame participants, again, as opposed to, and Colin alluded to this just now, as opposed to the classic red versus blue, good team versus bad team, whatever it may be, that just doesn't apply anymore. There are multiple sides, not quite infinite, but a lot of sides and different nuances within those, which means that actually the colors, the typical red, blue of wargaming, don't really work anymore. And we found that cells and sides have to be named per their actual name or their fictionalized name, whatever, and you will have shades within those cells as well. So it is absolutely not the old red versus blue. Okay, analysis, data capture, fundamental. I'm not actually going to talk to those because, again, we assume people understand wargaming. I am going to highlight the after action review. And again, shout out to Stephen Downes Martin, who has highlighted the importance of this. It takes time, it takes effort, it cannot be forgotten. I'm not going to go through those bullets. I just wanted to say that the after action review, the AAR, is fundamental. And then building confidence. So this is another mitigation to the risks associated with influence wargaming. And the only point I want to make here is just note that you need to assure or build the confidence in the outputs from the game, but then also the game itself. So 2 different things, and ideally those are then considered and promulgated and considered, but those 2 different sides of building confidence are absolutely crucial. Right, so that, as I said, was very much a wave-topping approach. I'm just going to show a couple of slides with some simple examples of representing the information environment and adjudication. Do not think these are the answer. I'm just pulling a couple of each out of the book to show you. So representing the information environment, fading geography and fading the map into the background. Don't lose it entirely because you still need to be geographically aware of where you are. But fading the map into the background and then looking at the information environment, you've got a range of very, very simple, and actually off to the left of this slide, even more simple, is very simple emoticons, smiley faces or unhappy faces. But this, what we call a marker track, is, to be honest, should feature in pretty much all war games because it just shows the population perceptions of groups of audiences towards certain actors. The numbers, and I'm not going to go into detail, it's in the handbook, the numbers indicate a stickiness whereby populations or audiences on the extremities of this marker track it would be more difficult to move their perception. So think about non-negotiable beliefs. So marker tracks, really simple, and that's one end of the spectrum, right the way through to this is a causal loop diagram, actually from TNO, which is the Netherlands equivalent of dstl. So that is a computerized visualization where you can interrogate the links and the resistance is another way of thinking about stickiness between various audiences, actors. So a whole spectrum of ways to represent the information environment, and it's that point which is critical. We need to have new ways to represent the information environment. Adjudication, again, two of many, 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 going from the left, very simple. That is just a way to better understand an adversary's or an audience's reaction. Instead of the classic war game, hey, you guys, what do you do now? Oh, okay, that's fine. It's just coming up with, I mean, these are just 4 example questions, come up with your own, but working the players through these questions really starts to get at the factors they are considering, their decision calculus. And that is just straightforward. On the right-hand side, deliberately simple and deliberately transparent. This is an influence diagram, which is completely transparent. So the players could see this and things would happen on the left. You could track them through and people would understand a starting point for an outcome. And that starting point then prompted or generated the player discussion about that outcome. And that approach is a deliberative approach. So you take an outcome and that prompts player discussions, which obviously enriches the adjudication process. So really quick, really simple examples. There are more in the book, but the point about the chapter is to prompt research into other ways of doing it. Okay, Colin, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Graham. So just coming out into the final sections of the book. So obviously we've got that part 1, part 2, chapters 1 to 2, and chapters 3 to 4. And we then end the book with our Annex A, which is case studies for the practitioner. And really, Annex A is just going to put then into practice a number of case studies to show influence war games and how they work. So each case study, and there are about 7 case studies there, have a set of general headings up on the top left, and each case study basically works through that kind of description to describe, you know, what it's about, what's the context and the aim and objectives of that war game, and then how basically you then represent elements of the influence war game aspects that we talk about in the handbook as we go through. So I'm going to pick out a couple on there. I noticed that Rex Bryan's on the call today. His case studies features. It's not one I'm talking about today. I'm sure he can happily talk about the Bryanania peace building simulator, which is one of the case studies that we talk about in the handbook. I'm just going to touch on the 3 in red there as you see it. And these are a combination of basically military and non-military and mixed war games, influence war games that we have in the handbook, for everybody to have a particular kind of look at. And really what we do with each of those case studies is we try and feature a particular aspect of how it represents the influence war games. So earlier, Graham mentioned about micro, meso, and macro is a really good technique for, you know, in some cases for design. There's a case study in here that talks about that very aspect in the design and delivery of that war game. And so it's not a solution for every influence war games, but just an example that you can use to put in your kind of like tool bag of techniques in terms of delivering and designing influence war games. If you get to the next slide, Graham. So I think the first one is, so the first war game here really, and it's quite a different war game, is really one that looks at basically an educational tool that uses gamification to enhance and develop the understanding of something called combi theory. That's the combi theory. It's a diagram in the middle bottom of the diagram is a behavioral science model which looks at capability, opportunity, and motivation, and how that equals behavior or a change in behavior and how you do that. So this is a game that's been developed and designed for the UK MD Joint Information Activities Group, and there's some of them on the call today. And they use this game to kind of use that as a teaching educational process in terms of teaching aspects of information operations, in this particular case, COM-B. So that's a gamification of that tool that I have that's in use today. So that's one that we go into. Next slide, Graham. So the next one is also one that's been we designed and delivered with Joint Information Activities Group leading. I think the individual that's designed this game is on the call today as well. And this is a really, really interesting one. This is called Defending Defender. So it's an educational influence war game again, and it's been designed as an immersive strategic communication card game based on HMS Defender. So that's a Type 45 naval platform, when it conducted a maritime freedom of navigation deployment off Crimea in June 2021. So the HMS Defender maritime deployment to the Black Sea, and you get this kind of Russian reaction to her presence and the subsequent battle of the narratives. And it's really an excellent example of strategic communication and that battle between UK and Russia, or really between London and Moscow, and defence's role within that particular kind of aspect. The game is designed to be an immersive tool, and it allows students to play through that scenario and absorb lessons on that historic action that was done back in June 2021. Okay, next slide, please. And then the last one I just want to touch on, I know Seb's not on the call today, and I'm really not going to say too much about this particular case study, but really just to kind of say highlight and say thank you to Seb and Emily for their input into the handbook with the malign strategic influence war game, which I know there's a full Georgetown brief on this game. It's well worth watching, which talks about that particular kind of aspect. And again, we use aspects of that in the case study, which has been inputted by Seb and Emily. So that's a really, really useful case study we have there. Okay, and then the last slide, I think then we can go into Q&A. So really, this slide really then basically concludes a preview of this war game. As I kind of stressed at the start, and Graham has mentioned a couple of times, it really is a preview of what's in the Influence Wargaming Handbook. And apologies, we couldn't go into massive amounts of detail in all the sections, but at least it hopefully gives you a flavour of what that handbook has in it. And also gives you an idea of the other kind of publications that are already available and out there that support this publication. So this publication is digitally released, just like all the other publications that we produce. It will be available on the UK Gov website, and it goes live on the 6th of July. So you're literally only 3 weeks away, and you'll be able to get your hands on that publication. You've got the front cover there, so you can use that to kind of check that you've got the right publication. And we don't have the web address it's going to be on just yet. I'm pretty confident that if you just search for UK MOD Influence Wargaming Handbook, you will find your right place for that, but we will let Seb know that link and get him to put it up on the Georgetown website so you can access it from here. In addition, if you are coming to the Connections UK conference, there's a conference, professional wargaming conference, which is a family of those conferences. The US events just occurring, and there's beyond soon. We have our Connections UK in September. If you come to that event, you also going to get your hands on a physical copy of the Influence Wargaming Handbook. So that's a spiral-bound copy that you'll be able to get your physical takeaway if you attend that conference. That's all I think I'm going to say on this slide, and really it's kind of over to Q&A. So I think that's back to Nick. And Graham, do you have any final words you want to say? Just want to come off a mute, Graham.
Too many buttons. And right, we're stopping share. We're stopping